The rooster crowed before sunrise, as always. Antonio was already up. At 58 years old, he had lost count of how many mornings he had woken up alone in that farmhouse. The bed, too big for one person, still kept the shape of a body on the left side that hadn't slept there in 7 years. He never changed the mattress on that side. He never had the courage to. He put on the same work clothes as always, worn denim pants, a plaid shirt patched at the elbow, a leather hat that had long since lost its original color. He went to the kitchen, lit the wood stove, and put the kettle on to heat. The silence of the house was so present that, at times, Antonio swore he could hear it. A low hum that filled the rooms where laughter, conversation, and the sound of pots being washed used to fill the air while he talked about his day in the corral. Rosa had died on an ordinary morning without warning, a heart problem no one knew she had. She was hanging clothes on the line when she collapsed. Antonio found her 20 minutes later, already gone, with a piece of clothing still clutched in her hand. Since then, he had learned to live the way only someone who has lost someone understands, keeping everything running but without really living. He woke up, worked, ate, slept, repeat. The farm stayed standing because he didn't know how to do anything else but work. It was that, or stop and feel the full size of the hole that had been left behind. He drank his coffee quickly, standing looking through the kitchen window as the corral lit up slowly with the orange glow of dawn. The cows were already up, waiting to be milked. The 2 mutts he'd rescued as puppies barked softly, asking for food. It was a life built entirely around routine. And routine, for Antonio, was the only thing that kept him standing. He had no children. He and Rosa had tried for years, without success, and in the end accepted that maybe it just wasn't meant to happen. "We have each other," she used to say, smiling, trying to make that feel like enough. And it was, until the day it stopped being enough, because suddenly there was only him. The nearest neighbors lived almost 5 miles away. Every now and then someone would show up, a cattle buyer, the vet, the boy who sold feed. Antonio treated everyone politely, but without warmth. He'd learned that the less attached he got to people, the less it hurt when they, one way or another, left. He knew that wasn't really living. He knew Rosa wouldn't want to see him like that, closed off, almost mute, treating every day like an obligation to get through. But he didn't know how to be any different. That morning, after finishing the milking and letting the cattle out to pasture, Antonio remembered he needed to go into town. The vet had recommended medicine for one of the cows, which had been coughing for a few days, and the farm supply store in town was the only place that carried that specific brand, almost an hour away on horseback. He preferred the horse to his old pickup truck, which was always breaking down. He saddled Trevon, his bay horse, checked the straps and set off a little after 7 in the morning. The road into town cut through farmland, small properties and a stretch of denser woods. And in the middle of that stretch stood an old concrete bridge, built decades earlier, crossing a creek that ran nearly dry most of the year. Few people passed that way. The main road, busier, was a few miles to the north. That quieter path was the one Antonio preferred. Fewer people, less small talk, less need to pretend he was fine. He didn't know that morning that same road he always took was about to change the rest of his life. The sun was already high when Trevon approached the bridge. The air was still cool, carrying that smell of damp earth the road had in the early hours. Antonio was riding lost in thought, thinking about the cattle medicine, when something on the ground caught his eye. Pieces of cardboard scattered along the roadside. He almost paid it no mind. Trash wasn't uncommon there, left by passers-by. But a few yards ahead he also saw an old blanket, folded over a rock, as if someone had left it there to dry in the sun. That was strange. He pulled the reins and stopped the horse. He looked around, no one in sight. He thought about continuing on. After all, he was in a hurry and this wasn't his business. But something made him look back, toward the underside of the bridge, where the shadow was deepest, and that's when he saw it. Under the bridge, leaning against the concrete wall, was a woman with two small children. Marta, he didn't know her name yet, lay on a piece of cardboard, holding her two children close, a boy who looked about 8 and a girl, younger, maybe 6. The three of them shared a single thin blanket, not nearly enough to cover all 3 bodies. Antonio froze on his horse for a moment. The family's clothes were dusty and rumpled, but there was something about the scene that didn't quite fit. They didn't look like people used to that kind of life. The boy had a small school backpack lying beside him, the kind any child carries to class. The girl slept clutching a cloth doll, old, with part of its hair already worn away, but clearly cared for, kept like a treasure. And the woman, even exhausted, her face marked by rough sleep and exposure to the elements, was still wearing a blouse that looked like it had been carefully chosen before all of this happened. These weren't the clothes of someone who had lived on the streets for years. These were the clothes of someone who, until recently, had a home, a closet, an organized life. Antonio felt his stomach tighten. He stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. His first instinct was to leave. Not my problem, he told himself. He had learned over the last few years to avoid getting involved in other people's problems. Carrying his own weight was enough. But just as he was about to pull the reins and continue on his way, he heard a soft cry. It was the girl. She had woken up. She was trying with her small hands to pull the thin blanket over her brother, who lay curled up and shivering beside her. But the blanket was too short. It couldn't cover them both at once. The girl was shivering too, her lips turning purple from the cold, but she kept trying to protect her brother before herself. Something inside Antonio's chest broke. The scene brought back, suddenly and without warning, a memory of Rosa. She had told him once, back when they were still dating, about a cloth doll she'd kept since childhood, a gift from her father before he died. Rosa used to say that doll was the only thing that still made her remember his voice. She kept it her whole life, even as an adult, even after they married. The girl under the bridge was holding an almost identical doll. Antonio felt his hands trembling on the reins. He dismounted slowly, trying not to make noise, but the sound of hooves on the dirt had already been enough. The woman woke with a start, eyes wide with fear. The moment she saw the silhouette of a man approaching, she pulled her two children close, instinctively placing herself between them and the stranger. "We don't want any trouble, sir," she said, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. "We're only here until morning. We're already leaving." Antonio stopped a few steps away, hands open, trying to look as unthreatening as possible. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt anyone." The woman didn't relax. Her eyes darted from the road to him, from him to her children, in a constant motion of vigilance. "How long have you been here?" Antonio asked, his voice softer now. She didn't answer right away. She lowered her eyes. That's when Antonio, without thinking much, opened the saddlebag he carried on his horse. Inside was bread, a piece of dried meat wrapped in cloth, and a bottle of water he kept for the trip. He held it all out to the children. The boy looked at his mother, silently asking permission. She hesitated, but seeing her son's hungry eyes, she finally nodded. The children began eating too fast, almost desperately, like people who don't know when their next meal will come. Antonio's chest tightened again. This wasn't the hunger of a single day. This was the hunger of people who no longer knew what it felt like to be certain of their next meal. "Where's your home?" Antonio asked, trying to understand the situation. The woman lowered her eyes, and for a moment it seemed she wouldn't answer. "We don't have a home anymore," she finally said, her voice breaking halfway through the sentence. Antonio stayed quiet, leaving space for her to continue if she wanted to. Slowly, between pauses and averted glances, she told him a little of her story. She said her name was Marta. She said she'd lost the home she lived in after a string of financial troubles. Her husband had worked on a rural property in the area, but he had died months earlier, Under circumstances she refused to explain. With no money and no close relatives who could help, she'd tried to take her children to the city to look for work. But the city hadn't been kind. After a few days trying to get by on what little they had, they ran out of resources. And that's how they ended up there, under that bridge, out of sight of anyone. Antonio listened carefully, but he noticed gaps in her story. Things Marta avoided saying. She spoke quickly about some points and grew vague, almost silent about others, especially when the subject was her husband's death. "Why didn't you go to a shelter in the city?" he asked. "There are places that help with this kind of situation." Marta glanced quickly at the road, as if she'd heard something. The gesture didn't go unnoticed. "Because they're looking for us," she said, almost in a whisper. Antonio frowned. "Who?" She didn't answer. She just pulled her children closer. Before he could press further, the distant sound of an engine cut through the morning silence. Marta went pale instantly. She pulled the children close and, with a quick gesture, told them to duck behind a larger piece of cardboard, as if it could really hide them. Antonio looked at the road. A vehicle, a dark pickup truck, the kind used on large farms, drove slowly across the bridge, slowing down exactly at the stretch where they were. The driver, a man wearing sunglasses, seemed to scan the surroundings carefully, like someone looking for something, or someone. Antonio followed the truck with his eyes until it disappeared around the next bend. When he turned back to Marta, he saw she was trembling and not from the cold. "Who was that man?" he asked. "I don't know," she answered too quickly. Antonio noticed by the way she looked away that she was lying, but he didn't push. Not yet. He stood up, took a few steps toward his horse, as if he were going to continue on his way. But he couldn't get on. He stood there, hand on the saddle, looking back. He saw the children, still with bits of food on their mouths, eyes wide with fear from the truck that had passed. He saw Marta, trying to look strong in front of her children, but with eyes full of an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. And he thought of his own house, big, empty, silent. He remembered a phrase Rosa used to say often, especially during the years they tried, without success, to have children. A person never loses anything by helping someone who truly needs it. They only gain. Antonio let go of the reins he was holding, and he went back. "I'm going to take you to my farm," Antonio said, approaching again. Marta looked at him as if he'd said something absurd. "We can't." "Yes, you can. You don't know us, sir. You don't know anything about us." Antonio looked at the children, who watched the conversation in silence, the boy holding his sister's hand. "I don't need to know you to know that no child should be sleeping on the ground, under a bridge, afraid of a car passing on the road." Marta began to cry, trying to hide her face with her hands. It was a restrained cry, the kind that comes from someone who has already cried too much and has no tears left, but whose body insists on trying anyway. Even so, she shook her head. "We bring danger, sir. It's not fair to put you in that position." Antonio thought for a moment. He looked at the children, exhausted, dirty, hungry, and then back at Marta, who could barely stand from tiredness. "You need somewhere safe to sleep and eat properly," he said. "That's not up for discussion, Marta." She looked at her children, desperation clear on her face. The desperation of someone who knows she has no strength left to keep going alone, but is also afraid to trust. "I'll bring you food, water, and a warm place to sleep," Antonio said. "If after that you want to leave, that's fine. I won't force anyone into anything. But at least let me help now." It was that offer, without pressure, without demands, that finally convinced Marta. She nodded, still with tears in her eyes, and helped her children up, gathering the little they had, the boy's backpack, the girl's doll, the thin blanket. The farm wasn't that far away, a little over half an hour's walk down the dirt road. Antonio considered his options, but in the end decided the simplest thing would be to walk, leading Travone by the reins. He helped Sophia, the youngest and most tired of the children, climb into the saddle, holding her steady as the horse took its first steps. "Hold on here, nice and easy," he said, adjusting the girl's small hands on the short reins while he walked alongside, one hand always close, ready to catch her if needed. Marta and Davy walked on foot, one on each side of the horse, the boy occasionally hopping to keep up with Antonio's brisker pace. Along the way, no one said much. The children looked around, at the pasture, the fences, the sky beginning to take on shades of orange, in silence, as if they still couldn't believe what was happening. Marta walked close to her son, whispering words of comfort that seemed more directed at herself than at him. Antonio walked on ahead, his heart racing, not entirely sure what he was doing. He only knew he wouldn't be able to live with himself if he'd left that family under the bridge. When they arrived at the farm, the children stood frozen at the entrance, looking inside the house as if standing before something extraordinary. To them, having spent the last few weeks sleeping in bus stations, under overhangs, and finally under a bridge, that simple farmhouse looked like a palace, a real bed, a bathroom with hot water, a kitchen with food stored in cupboards. The girl, still clutching her cloth doll, asked quietly, "Can I sleep in that bed?" Antonio smiled, for the first time in a long while a smile that reached his eyes. "You can. That bed is yours for as long as you're here." He settled Marta and the children into one of the guest rooms, which he'd barely used since Rosa died. He made a simple soup, the way Rosa used to, and served it to the three of them. This time, the children ate slowly, without that desperate rush from before, feeling, perhaps for the first time in weeks, that the next meal wasn't uncertain. That night, for the first time in many days, the two children slept safely, in a real bed, under a roof that kept the wind out. But Antonio couldn't sleep. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the new sounds of his own house, soft footsteps in the hallway, the sound of running water in the bathroom, the different kind of silence that comes from a house that had suddenly filled with people again. There was something about that family that didn't add up, the way Marta avoided talking about her husband, the way the boy startled every time he heard an engine approaching, even from far away, the way Marta, before bed, had gone to the window and stood there, staring out at the road for several minutes. Antonio knew what fear looked like, and that family carried far more fear than a simple loss of home or job usually causes. He decided that, the next day, he would need to understand what was really going on. The following days brought a new, strange routine to the farm. Marta, even as a guest, insisted on helping with everything she could, doing laundry, helping in the kitchen, trying, in her own way, to repay the kindness somehow. The boy, Davy, began following Antonio around the corral, curious about the animals, asking endless questions about the cattle, the chickens, the horse Travone. The girl, Sophia, started spending her afternoons on the porch, tending a small garden bed that Antonio, without much planning, decided to set aside for her. "Your garden," he told her, and the girl's eyes lit up in a way they hadn't in a long time. But Antonio kept noticing signs that troubled him. Marta never let the children play near the road, even within the safe boundaries of the property. She never went out alone, not even to fetch water from the well. She always asked before opening any door who was arriving, and at night she checked the bedroom windows more than once, like someone double-checking locks she already knows are secure, just to be sure. Until one night, after the children had gone to sleep, Antonio decided to ask directly. He found Marta in the kitchen, sitting at the table, staring at a cup of tea going cold in front of her, untouched. "Marta," he said, sitting down across from her, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." She raised her tired eyes and nodded slowly. "Who are you running from?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that Antonio thought she wouldn't answer. But then, her voice trembling, Marta began to speak. She told him that her husband Joaquim had worked for years as an estate manager on a rural property belonging to an influential man in the region, a businessman named Ricardo Aguiar, owner of land, a trucking company, and, according to rumors around town, political connections that made sure very little against him ever reached the courts. Over time, Joaquim began noticing irregularities in the documents that passed through his hands: falsified land records, property transfers that made no sense, money movements that didn't match the farm's official accounting. At first, he tried to ignore it. He needed the job. He had a family to support. But the more he saw, the more he realized it wasn't an accounting error. It was a deliberate scheme of land grabbing and money laundering, involving, among other things, properties belonging to small farmers who had been pushed out or deceived over the years. Joaquim decided to gather evidence. He kept copies of documents, notes, records. He planned to report everything to the authorities, but he never got the chance. He died in a work accident that, according to Marta, never made sense to anyone who knew him. A tractor that, according to the official report, had overturned on its own on flat ground with no witnesses nearby. Before he died, however, Joaquim had given Marta a small backpack, the same backpack David had been carrying for days, never letting it out of his sight. Inside the backpack, hidden in an interior compartment Joaquim had sewn by hand, were the documents he had gathered. The complete proof of the scheme. Since her husband's death, people connected to Ricardo Aguiar had been after the family, trying to recover those documents. And, Marta suspected, trying to make sure she never got the chance to tell the truth to anyone. "That's why we fled the city," she said finally, wiping away her tears. "We went to several places. We ran out of money, and in the end, we ended up under that bridge, because it was the only place I thought no one would look." Antonio sat in silence for a long moment, taking it all in. "You should have told me this sooner," he said finally, though without anger in his voice. "Only concern. I was afraid of putting you in danger too." Antonio looked at the backpack, sitting in a corner of the kitchen, looking so harmless. "It's too late for that now," he said. "You're going to stay here, and I'm going to help fix this." That same night, just hours after the conversation, Antonio woke to a strange noise outside. He got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight he kept by the bed, and went out into the yard, barefoot, careful not to make a sound. Moonlight partially lit the property. Antonio walked to the fence separating the property from the road and, pointing the flashlight at the ground, saw fresh tire tracks, different from his own trucks, wider, from a larger vehicle. His heart raced. He followed the tracks a few yards and found, near one of the house's side windows, boot prints in the mud, still soft from the previous afternoon's rain. Someone had approached the house, maybe trying to peek through the window, maybe trying to force their way in. Impossible to know for sure, but enough to make clear that the family's safety could no longer be guaranteed there. Antonio went back inside, trying to stay calm, his chest tight with worry. He found Marta already awake, sitting on the bed, holding her restless children close. She looked at him, and no words were needed. The expression on Antonio's face said it all. "They found us," Marta whispered, her voice thick with fear. Antonio nodded, trying to seem more confident than he actually felt. "We're going to fix this, but first I need to put you somewhere safer on the property." The next morning, before dawn, Antonio moved Marta and the children to a small support house in a more remote, less visible part of the farm, originally used to store tools and occasionally house seasonal workers during harvest. It wasn't as comfortable as the main house, but it was isolated, hidden by a dense stretch of vegetation and practically invisible from the road. While the family settled in, Antonio decided he needed to act. He couldn't keep treating this as a problem he'd solve on his own, little by little. He needed real help. He drove into town in his old pickup and went to the police station. He brought with him, hidden inside his jacket, the documents Marta had finally handed over to him. trusting him fully for the first time. The officer who received him, a middle-aged man named Ferreira, was well aware of Ricardo Aguiar's reputation in the region. And, by the cautious tone with which he handled the matter, it was clear this wasn't going to be simple. "I'm going to need to go through all of this carefully," Ferreira said, flipping through the documents with growing attention. "If what's here is true, this is big, much bigger than a land dispute." "And in the meantime?" Antonio asked. "The family's still at risk." Ferreira thought for a moment. "I'll request extra patrols near your farm. But, Mr. Antonio, you need to understand. People like Ricardo Aguiar have connections everywhere. We need to be careful about who knows about this." While waiting for the investigation to move forward, Antonio found himself going through, without really meaning to, some old boxes stored in the attic. Belongings of Rosa's he'd never had the courage to go through after her death. It was there, among old notebooks and yellowed photographs, that he found something that left him cold. A notebook of Rosa's, dated almost 8 years earlier, contained pages full of something he never knew his wife had been investigating: suspicious land purchase records in the region, including areas neighboring their own farm, and mentions, in tight, nervous handwriting, of a name that now struck him as terribly familiar: Ricardo Aguiar. Antonio's hands trembled as he flipped through those pages. In her final months, Rosa had begun suspecting something about neighboring land purchases, a process involving documents she considered too strange to be legitimate. There was even a note, dated just days before her death, mentioning that she planned to see a lawyer in town to better understand the situation. She never got the chance. Antonio brought the notebook to Marta, telling her what he'd found. Marta was overcome with emotion, realizing that Antonio's wife, years earlier, had begun suspecting the very same man who was now hunting her family. The same Ricardo Aguiar, likely behind Joaquim's death as well. "This can't be a coincidence," Marta said, staring at the notebook as if it held answers to questions she hadn't even known she had. The possibility that Rosa had, without his knowledge, begun uncovering the very same scheme, now endangering that family, and that her sudden death might not have been as simple as everyone believed, reopened a wound Antonio thought had long since healed. But at the same time, it gave him a new sense of purpose. That family hadn't appeared in his life by chance. Somehow fate, or something like it, had brought together the pieces of a story his own wife had begun to uncover years before, without ever getting the chance to finish it. Antonio also handed Rosa's notebook to Detective Ferreira, who recognized information there that connected directly to the documents left behind by Joaquim, forming a much broader, more solid picture of Ricardo Aguiar's scheme. The investigation gained momentum. In the following weeks, with support from the police and a prosecutor who personally took on the case, after grasping the severity of the evidence, the investigation moved quickly. Dozens of falsified documents were found, related to the illegal seizure of land from small farmers in the region, many of them pressured into selling far below market value under veiled threats, or simply had their properties stolen through forged paperwork. The scheme involved corrupt notary office employees, a money laundering system run through Ricardo Aguiar's trucking company, and, most seriously, strong evidence that Joaquim's death had not been an accident. Ricardo Aguiar was arrested weeks later, along with several of his main collaborators, in an operation that made waves throughout the region. For Marta, it was a mix of relief and pain. Relief at finally being able to live without constant fear. Pain at having it officially confirmed that her husband's death hadn't been an accident, but a murder, disguised to keep the truth from coming out. "At least he didn't die for nothing," Marta said, crying beside Antonio, on the day the news of the arrest broke. "He did it in the end. Even though he's not here anymore, he did it." Antonio felt for the first time in a long while a strange and comforting sensation that somehow he had helped close a chapter that involved not just that family, but Rosa herself, who, without knowing it, had planted the first seeds of that investigation years before. Once everything was resolved, a natural question arose. What would happen to Marta, Davy, and Sophia now? They had nowhere to go back to. The city held no good memories left. And over those weeks on the farm, something had changed, not just in their lives, but in Antonio's as well. He noticed, looking out at the yard where there had once only been silence, that there was movement now. Davy ran after the chickens, gradually learning the chores of the corral, always happy to help. Sophia tended her small garden bed with enormous pride, showing Antonio every new sprout as if it were a scientific discovery. And Marta, little by little, found her own place there too, helping with the simple administration of the property, something she'd always had a talent for, even without ever having had the chance to develop it before. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, Antonio said without much preamble, "You can stay, not as guests, as family if you want." Marta looked at him, surprised, her eyes already filling with tears again, but different tears this time. "Are you sure, Antonio?" He looked around. The house, which for 7 years had been just a place to sleep and eat between one workday and the next, now had voice, had laughter, had life. "I've never been more sure of anything," he answered. The months that followed completely transformed the farm's routine, and Antonio's. Davy began joining him in almost every task, learning fast, questioning everything in the curious way only a child can be. Sophia, little by little, expanded her small garden, which wasn't so small anymore, and dreamed big. When she grew up, she wanted to have a farm full of flowers and little animals, as she put it. One afternoon, Sophia showed up holding the old cloth doll, the one that had been with her since the days under the bridge, and handed it to Antonio. "I want you to keep her." Antonio, surprised, asked why. "Because you saved us," the girl answered simply, the way only a child can simplify things so big. Antonio held the doll in his hands, feeling his eyes burn with emotion. He thought of Rosa, of the doll she'd kept her whole life, of the strange, almost inexplicable way things sometimes connect. That night, looking out the bedroom window, the same room where for 7 years only silence had lived, Antonio heard voices coming from the kitchen, laughter, the sound of dishes being washed, Marta humming a tune softly as she finished tidying the kitchen, and Davy telling Sophia excitedly some news about the newborn calves. He realized, with a clarity he hadn't felt in years, that the house had finally come back to life. Antonio never passed by the old bridge the same way again. Every time he had to take that road into town, he'd slow the horse as he approached, and look for a moment at the exact spot where he'd found that woman and her 2 children sleeping cold and hungry, trying to survive an injustice greater than any of them could have imagined alone. He remembered the mother trying to protect her children with a blanket too small. He remembered the children eating in a rush, like people who don't know if there will be a tomorrow. And he remembered, most of all, the decision he almost didn't make, the decision to turn back when everything in him said to keep going and not get involved. In the end, he understood something Rosa had always tried to teach him one way or another over the years they were together, that helping someone is never about what you lose. It's always about what you gain. The family had lost a home but found a place to belong. And Antonio, who believed he'd lost for good any chance of having a family after Rosa's death, discovered that sometimes life gives back, in unexpected ways, what we thought was gone forever. Because, in the end, some people come into our lives exactly when everything feels most empty, and sometimes the decision to stop for a few minutes, just a few minutes, to help a stranger can change not just the fate of an entire family. It can change our own too.